Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. We're just going to give participants a minute to come into the Zoom, and we'll get started in about 1 minute. All right, it looks like still a few people coming in. We'll give everybody 1 more minute, like a half minute. All right, looks like it's kind of starting to plateau. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for my second annual Youth Town Hall. I'm Assemblymember Berman, and I represent the 24th District in the California State Assembly, which includes Southern San Mateo County and Northern Santa Clara County. And for those of you who aren't necessarily familiar with what's Northern Santa Clara County, Southern San Mateo County, I represent a little sliver of Cupertino, all of Sunnyvale, Mountain View, Los Altos Hills, Palo Alto, East Palo Alto, Menlo Park, Woodside, Portola Valley, Atherton, a little bit of Redwood City, all the way out to the coast, Half Moon Bay, like the photo behind me, down to Pescadero and to the Santa Cruz County border, about 30 miles of California coast. We held our first youth town hall in 2019. And its success inspired me to make this an annual event. But unfortunately, like a lot of things in 2020, we had to postpone it because of COVID. Now we're back, and I couldn't be more excited to be joined by a great group of interested, engaged, and incredibly resilient youth and young adults from my district. I'm fortunate to represent a district full of younger constituents who care enough about the world around them to come out and speak their minds to their elected officials. And let me tell you, we pay attention when you show up. I hear from older constituents all the time, but when youth come to advocate, elected officials really sit up and take notice. In my first youth town hall, I was asked some of the hardest hitting and most thoughtful questions I've ever been asked at a community event. I just told somebody that earlier today. I'm looking forward to hearing about your experiences and reflections on the last 2 years. I know that the pandemic has been uniquely hard on young people, but I want to know more. I want to know how it has impacted you personally, what changes you'd like to see, both from failures and successes. Is there something from the pandemic era that you hope stays, for example? And beyond the pandemic, I want to know what your priorities are and how you'd like to see those priorities achieved. The votes that my colleagues and I make in the legislature have the greatest lasting impact on young people. What your elected representatives do today shapes the world that you will live in for 10, 25, or 50 years from now, or a lot longer. And the California State Legislature plays a big role in your daily lives. We work on issues like education, from childcare through college. This year, we passed a huge education funding package of $123.9 billion, the most in the state's history. This equates to historic levels of per student funding. We also passed an agreement with UC and CSU to admit more in-state students while increasing those systems budgets. We allocated $4 billion to the Children and Youth Behavioral Health Initiative, which will help young people up to age 25 cope with anxiety, depression, stress, and other mental health challenges. And this is an issue I'm very passionate about. A few other education highlights from the state this year include a new law, which makes an addition to the reasons a student can receive an excused absence in cases of illness. And the new option that was created by this law is, quote, for the benefit of the behavioral health of the pupil. We also required that mental health instruction be included in existing health education courses at middle and high schools. And lastly, a law championed by a UC Davis student, which will require CSU, the community colleges, and public schools that serve grades 6 through 12 to provide menstrual products free of charge in designated places on campus. California paves the way for the rest of the country. Many groundbreaking laws passed here gain momentum around the country. In addition, rather than having two sets of rules, one for California's 40 million residents and one for the rest of the country, the business community often adopts nationwide standards that meet California's requirements. This is one of the reasons California's environmental policies are so important. The legislature allocated $15 billion over the next 4 years towards climate change and environmental priorities, making it the largest investment California has ever made towards a green future. Of course, beyond the looming existing threat of climate change, housing affordability and the cost of living is the biggest issue facing my district. This is one of the reasons local elections are so important. Your city council is the land use authority of the city. This means that they vote to approve housing projects. However, many of our local cities have failed for decades to build enough housing, leaving us in the situation we are in now, where young people can't afford to live here and essential workers who we depend on have to commute in from the Central Valley or further away, or live close by but in crowded and unsafe conditions. In response to our housing crisis and failure at the local level, the state has stepped in to assert more authority and spur more housing. The legislature passed a series of bills to address a variety of causes that have contributed to the lack of housing production in our state. In addition, the budget package makes the largest ever commitment to address homelessness over a 2-year period and includes roughly $12 billion in new funding for homelessness programs over the next 2 years. As I mentioned earlier, another big priority for me is youth mental health. I grew up in Palo Alto, I went to Pali, and I remember as if it was yesterday how much pressure there is growing up in Silicon Valley. I also know that it's gotten even more competitive since I was growing up here in the 80s and 90s. The health and safety of our youth is one of my highest priorities, and I've introduced bills relating to youth mental health 4 of my 5 years in the Assembly. I tell youth mental health advocates, and I mean it, that if they have a good bill idea on this topic every year, I will introduce a bill on it every year. A few years ago, I authored AB 2639, a bill aimed at preventing student suicide, the second leading cause of death among 10 to 24-year-olds. AB 2639 requires schools to review their suicide prevention policies at least every 5 years and update them as needed. These up-to-date policies will better equip education professionals to address the many issues faced by children and youth in the modern world. In addition, I secured $1.7 million in the budget to develop and distribute a youth suicide prevention training for all students, teachers, and administrators who wish to voluntarily take it. The online training in suicide awareness and prevention is available to all public schools serving students in grades 7 through 12. Thank you to everyone who took my youth priorities survey. I will go through the results in a few minutes and talk about some of the really interesting bill ideas that were submitted. But first, I want to share some updates and background information about what I've worked on over the last year. I will also answer live questions and we'll take questions from the chat. If you'd rather submit a question via the chat, please do that at any time. If you ask a live question when we get to the live question section, we're going to give people a voucher for a free boba if you leave us your email and your school in the chat. If this event is like my previous youth events, you will have more questions than we have time to answer, but I promise that I'll get through as many questions as we can. This year, I introduced the most ambitious package of bills of my 5 years in the Assembly. And I'm incredibly proud to report that we've been very successful at either getting these bills approved by the legislature and signed by the governor, or getting the ideas inserted into this year's state budget, which means that we didn't need to keep moving the bills forward. Due to COVID-related restrictions on the legislature's work, legislators were only allowed to try to pass 12 bills this year. 10 of my 12 bills passed through the legislature and were signed by the governor, while the other 2 bills were included in the state budget. So we went 12 for 12. One bill that we got added to the budget stemmed from a bill idea that a Foothill Community College student brought to me a few years ago. The students' idea was to let homeless community college students sleep in their cars on campus, in campus parking lots. I didn't realize how bad the situation was, and I was shocked to learn that when a survey was done, 19% of community college students had experienced homelessness in the prior 12 months leading up to taking that survey. I introduced a bill to address this issue in 2019, but was unsuccessful in the end. However, even though the bill died along the legislative process, the effort was very successful at increasing awareness as to how big of a basic needs crisis we have among community college students and, to a bit lesser extent, among CSU and UC students. We didn't give up. My staff and I did more research about best practices to address student homelessness and food insecurity, and we kept on talking with and pressuring various stakeholders. This year, I was thrilled to get language in the state budget to create a basic needs center and hire a basic needs coordinator on every community college campus in California. This will provide a single point of contact for students to more easily access, gain awareness of, and be connected to basic needs services and resources around housing, food insecurity, and mental health. I was also successful at getting $30 million in ongoing funding to support this effort, meaning every year the state will spend $30 million to support these basic needs centers and basic needs coordinators. Excuse me. The other effort we got into the budget is to establish a statewide Office of School-Based Health, which will help ensure greater access to healthcare services at K-12 schools across California, including offering mental health counseling on school campuses, which we know are so critical to supporting student well-being. This was also a multi-year effort, kind of like the basic needs effort at community college campuses. In this instance, Governor Newsom vetoed a similar bill that I introduced in 2019. And so one lesson from these eventual victories, which is really important, is that they started with defeats. I started off failing at these efforts the first time I tried, but don't give up just because you don't succeed at something the first time you try it. You can learn a lot from that experience. I've learned a ton from a lot of failures that I've had. And those lessons, the things I've learned from those failures have helped me be successful the next time. My bill that has perhaps garnered the most attention, AB 1346, would ban the sale of small gas-powered engines, such as leaf blowers and lawnmowers, starting in 2024. A lot of people don't realize this, and I did not until I introduced the bill, but this year in 2021, these small gas-powered engines are set to overtake passenger vehicles, cars, as the leading emitter of smog-forming pollution in California. My bill would end the sale of this highly polluting equipment and transition California to cleaner and quieter alternatives. And critically, I was also able to secure $30 million in the state budget to help small landscaping businesses transition to zero emission alternatives. While zero emission equipment is far safer for workers, there will be an additional upfront cost. And I wanted to make sure that we address that financial burden that some small businesses might face. Last year, in 2020, in response to a bill that I introduced right after the pandemic hit, elections officials in California mailed a ballot to every active registered voter in California, and every county adopted a ballot tracking system so that voters could be assured that their ballot was properly processed and counted. This emergency effort was wildly successful, and California had the highest voter turnout in 70 years. This year, in 2021, I wrote the law to make these vote by mail changes permanent. At a time when other states across the country are making it harder for people to vote, I'm proud that California is proving that we can have safe, secure, fair, and accessible elections. Finally, since the day I was sworn in 5 years ago, I've been working to improve our higher education system so that it serves the needs of students and their families in the 21st century. After 4 years of informational hearings and hundreds of conversations with students about the challenges that they face, we decided to laser focus on the unnecessarily complex transfer process from community colleges to four-year institutions. I introduced a very ambitious bill, the Student Transfer Achievement Reform Act of 2021, the STAR Act of 2021, to reimagine the transfer process from the student perspective and remove barriers to transfer, such as expanding the use of the wildly successful but underutilized associate degree for transfer, and establishing a single general education transfer pathway that meets transfer admission to CSU and UC. Going from two general education pathways to one makes it easier for students to apply to both CSU and UC, and keeps their options open if students don't yet know where they want to transfer. I also introduced a complementary bill, AB 1111, to create a common course numbering system so that comparable courses at different community colleges have the same course number. Many students take courses at multiple community colleges on their way to an associate's degree, and the current system creates unnecessary confusion and delay. As all of you can tell, I'm really passionate about what we've gotten accomplished this year. That's just the tip of the iceberg. I didn't cover a handful of other bills that I really love, but I want to make sure that we take some time to share your perspectives, and I want to talk a little bit about the result of the Youth Priorities Survey. I'm so thankful to everyone who took the time to share your thoughts with me on our inaugural Youth Priorities Survey that we sent out. One of the questions we asked was, what can politicians like myself do to better represent youth? Some common themes were listen to us, ask us what we think, hear directly from us, hold more public meetings for youth. That's exactly the goal of this event and of the survey, because I do want to listen and hear what all of you think. Some of you also said we should go to schools to talk directly with students, and I love doing that. It's probably one of my favorite activities as an elected official. And if there are any teachers on this call, please send invites to Berman Scheduler, that's all one word, Berman Scheduler at asm.ca.gov. Berman Scheduler at asm.ca.gov. You can also submit invites on my website if you want. And let me know if there's a good time for me to come and talk with your students. While we're on the subject of teachers, thank you, teachers. It's an essential and too often thankless profession. And a special shout out to all the teachers, because more than half of our survey responses said they heard about this event through their teachers. We had responses from a wide range of ages, and we had over 100 responses so far. And the range of ages ranged from preteens all the way up to somebody in their 40s. And the vast majority of the respondents were between the ages of 16 and 21. As a 40-year-old, I appreciate the youthful exuberance of some of the older constituents who responded to my survey, although it was meant to be geared just at youth. There were a range of answers for how engaged people feel with their government. Hopefully, after taking the survey, people felt a bit more engaged than when they started. And we're up to over 100 people right now on this Zoom, which is awesome, and shows a really high level of engagement. If you didn't have a chance to fill out the survey, I hope you'll take a moment to add into the chat from 1 to 10 how engaged you feel with your government. 1 is you don't feel very engaged at all. 10 is you feel very highly engaged. When asked whether you feel like voters in your community vote in the best interest of young people in mind, over 80% of you said either somewhat or no, which means that fewer than 20% of you said yes. And that's very disconcerting to me, and says that, you know, we really have more work to do to make sure that the voices and opinions of young people are more accurately reflected, frankly, in both votes and in the decisions that elected officials make. And even if you can't vote for me, I still represent you and I care what you think. And you can always reach out to me to advocate for your views. When asked about the biggest source of stress of your life, the biggest answers by far were, in this order: academic pressure, over 60% listed academic pressure, career and college decisions, and mental health. Similarly, when asked about how COVID-19 impacted your lives, the top answers were mental health challenges, isolation, increased anxiety, loss of personal connection, and it was a tie between loss of opportunities to pursue your passion and difficulties with distance learning. I've mentioned this before, student mental health was a huge issue when I went to Pali. And it's only gotten worse over the years, not to mention over the past 18 months during the pandemic. And if you have suggestions on how your state government, on how I can support your mental health, I sincerely hope that you'll share those ideas with me. I know the past year and a half have been some of the hardest on my mental health personally, and there are no easy solutions, but know that you are not alone. On a lighter note, what respondents enjoy most about their communities was really interesting. The largest response was proximity to open space and parks. This is one of the best things about my district, with all of the amazing parks, open space areas, and 30 miles of California coastline that I represent. People also said safety, good schools, proximity to family, friends, and shopping. Lastly, I asked what you think are the biggest issues facing our state. If you didn't get a chance to complete a survey but want to share your thoughts on the biggest issues facing our state, please add them to the chat as well. The most common answer by far was homelessness and housing affordability. This is such an important issue for me, for our region, and for the state. And we desperately need to do more to build more housing for all Californians, not just the very wealthy. It also makes sense that folks who love their open spaces said the environment is one of their top priorities. This has always been a critical issue, and more so every day. While the federal government is mired in gridlock and unwilling to act to improve the environment and combat global warming, California must step up and lead. Other top answers were poverty and income inequality and healthcare affordability, all issues I totally agree are critical issues for our area and for our state. So thanks again. I'm so happy that so many of you responded. And if you want to keep, if you haven't had a chance yet, don't hesitate to complete the survey or provide your thoughts in the chat. One of my favorite questions that we asked was, do you have a bill idea? If you could change something in your community, what would you change and how would you propose changing it? And we received some fantastic bill ideas. And while I don't have time to share all of the ideas that were submitted, I definitely wanted to share a few of them that we've looked into. And this is how I get multiple bill ideas for bills that I've introduced. This past year, 2 or 3 bills out of the 12 that I moved forward came directly from constituents, including some that were brought to my attention in these kinds of community chats that I've done. The first idea has to do with reforming what's called SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, in other states otherwise known as food stamps. And the question was, I think that California could be a leader in revolutionizing the accessibility and quality of SNAP online purchasing. I think California should innovate a way that small independent grocery stores, local corner stores, farmers markets, and direct-to-consumer farmers could sell their goods online and accept SNAP as payment alongside Amazon, Walmart, and a handful of other large grocery stores. I also think that California should strike the college student work requirement for SNAP. Love this idea. I think it's a fantastic idea and something that I've been advocating for. Unfortunately, California as a state does not have the authority to remove the college student work requirement for SNAP, nor can we automatically approve a retailer to accept SNAP. The federal government determines food stamp eligibility, SNAP eligibility, but I did sign on to a letter urging Congress to pass a federal bill, HR 1919, by my former colleague in the state assembly, now Congressmember Jimmy Gomez, which would allow college students access to CalFresh if they meet the income requirement. Specifically, this bill also specifies that college students would no longer be required to work 20 hours or meet one of the other 10 qualifications in order to qualify for CalFresh, thus eliminating the many barriers that make it really challenging for college students to benefit from CalFresh. Unfortunately, the federal bill did not pass, or at least has not passed yet. But my hope is that it will in the future. And as I mentioned earlier, basic needs access is one of my priorities in the Assembly. And I've run other bills relating to CalFresh reform, including a bill to allow beneficiaries to use texting to either apply for or renew their CalFresh applications. Let's make this as easy as possible for people. So we'll continue to look into ways to make sure that no students go hungry. Another bill idea, somebody said, I really want to see a law banning loot boxes in video games. They're like slot machines where you pay for a chance to get something really good, but most of the time you get nothing or trash items. I feel this is very distressing, since children and teenagers like me are exposed to loot boxes constantly. Belgium did it back in 2019. This is a really interesting idea, and to be honest, one that I don't know much about, but it's a great example of why hearing directly from young people is so important. And we talked about it with, amongst my staff, and I know that one of our interns and my chief of staff's daughter, who's a teen, have very strong opinions about this issue also. So we're going to look into what Belgium did and what states might possibly be able to do as well, and really appreciate the suggestion. Another bill idea, there were kind of two similar bill ideas. One was, it said, I would fight against homelessness by in some way building more affordable housing and helping people purchase that housing. And a similar idea said, I would change the homelessness population. We live in a very wealthy area where we could provide shelter and food for our homeless population. I think we should open local homeless shelters and make a law requiring the county or city to help anyone who is homeless. And a lot of people wrote in with suggestions to tackle the issue of homelessness. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a top priority for me and for my colleagues in the state legislature. I was so pleased to see that the state's new Project Home Key program worked with Life Moves, a local nonprofit, and the city of Mountain View to contribute $14.35 million to build a new interim site for people experiencing homelessness locally. Based on Home Key's success in 2020, Governor Newsom announced the next phase of its nation-leading homeless housing initiative with a $2.75 billion investment to expand the program to purchase and rehabilitate buildings, including hotels, motels, vacant apartment buildings, tiny homes, or other properties, and convert them into up to 14,000 more permanent long-term housing units for people experiencing or at risk of homelessness. Home Key prioritizes speed and cost efficiency by making competitive grants available to local governments across the state. And I know that after the success of this Mountain View site, where they built 100 units for a fraction of the cost of what it usually costs, and in 6 months at the groundbreaking of this site, I said, when I served on the Palo Alto City Council, it took us longer than 6 months to put in a park bench. And they put in 100 units of interim supportive housing in 6 months. It's fantastic. And I know that after that success, a lot of other cities, local cities, have received Home Key grants to build homeless housing, including in Palo Alto and Redwood City. And I know a lot of other communities around here are looking into this. My office will keep working to find ways to house homeless people and create more affordable housing. Okay, so now we're going to pivot to the live section of our event. We want to pivot to some Q&A. And I know our first series of questions are from a group called, I might pronounce it wrong, Bailey, or maybe Bali, the Bay Area Youth Lobbying Initiative. They're a local student-based organization empowering individuals to affect long-term climate policy. After this Q&A, I'll take live questions and then questions from the chat. So keep adding questions and comments to the chat, and then we'll take some live questions and then take some chat questions. So Katie, thank you so much for being here today. I'll turn it over to you to ask some of the questions that you and your peers have come up with.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much, Assemblymember Berman. It's great to be here. Yeah, so we had a couple of questions for you. The first one is, as a member of the Transportation Committee, what steps are you looking to take to implement climate and environmental protections? What are the plans for renewable energy and transportation? And do you prioritize public transportation over highway expansion?
Thank you, Katie, for the question. It's a great question because transportation is the largest source of California's greenhouse gas emissions. And that's one of the reasons why when I got elected, I requested to the Speaker of the Assembly, I asked him to put me on the Transportation Committee because it's critical to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and achieving our climate change goals. And I absolutely prioritize public transportation over highway expansion. As a member of the Transportation Committee, I've voted to move forward legislation that expands access to electric vehicle rebates for low-income consumers, builds out charging infrastructure, which is so important if we're going to meet our goals of EVs on the road, and incentivizes zero-emission trucks and buses. And this year, we are investing $3.5 billion for zero-emission vehicles and infrastructure, which is unprecedented. So it's going to be a huge area moving forward, and one that I'm lucky and really happy and proud to be on the Transportation Committee to help support.
Wow, thank you so much for that. All right, so our next question is, environmental protection is closely linked to both social and economic equity. How do you think the state should proceed with environmental legislation while taking these factors into account?
Yeah, no, thank you, Katie. For decades, environmental legislation mostly referred to ensuring that there was open space in communities, but that didn't apply to all communities. It also meant that we were going to transition to cleaner energy, but didn't always look at issues such as air pollution from industrial sites in poorer communities in California. And the state has recognized that this old way of thinking left many communities behind. And we're now considering equity in every one of our environmental policies. It's become a critical component of the analysis of different environmental policies that we adopt. And this is really the heart of the environmental justice movement. And we're seeing a greater focus on targeted investments and providing resources to aid park poor communities, or to clean up industrial sites in all communities that were typically placed in our poorer communities, and to ensuring that our environmental programs truly benefit all Californians.
Thank you. And you mentioned that your Transportation Committee is putting a lot of investments into electric vehicles this year. Are there any programs in place within that to help underrepresented individuals?
Yes, absolutely. I don't know the names of them off the top of my head, but that's always a key priority, is making sure that the funding that we put in and the kind of focus of our efforts is on people that otherwise wouldn't be able to afford to make the transition to zero emission vehicles. So we know that there's a certain population of Californians who are have been very successful and have made a lot of money. We don't need to help them get EVs. They're going to do it on their own. But there are a lot of people that might never be able to afford an EV, but for some state funding to help them make them transition. So, that's and we know that a lot of those people, frankly, are driving some of the highest pollution emitting vehicles on our roads. And so we can get a ton of bang for our buck if we help them transition from a car that, a 20 or 30-year-old car that they are currently driving that might not even have to pass smog checks, that might be grandfathered out of smog checks in exchange for an electric vehicle. And these are a lot of our communities that are driving the furthest because they can't afford to live near where they work. And so they have to drive even further, and they're doing it in internal combustion engine vehicles and polluting even more. So it's a big priority to focus on some of our lower income communities with these programs.
Thank you for that. All right, so this next question refers to a recent oil spill in Orange County. So what is your stance on offshore oil drilling in California? And if you don't support it, will you pledge to work towards the reduction/elimination of permits granted for new drilling projects off of California's coast?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't support it. I don't support offshore drilling. And I absolutely pledge to work towards the elimination of permits granted for new drilling projects off California's coast. California has not issued permits for new drilling in decades. It has issued permits related to existing wells. And I've supported a number of bills to limit offshore oil drilling as well as land-based drilling in oil wells in our communities in California. This is a really challenging issue because most of the oil drilling off the California coast is technically in federal waters and therefore falls under federal jurisdiction, not state jurisdiction. But I was pleased to hear that the West Coast Ocean Protection Act, introduced by Senator Dianne Feinstein, California's senior senator last year, aims to permanently ban oil and gas drilling in federal waters off the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington. Unfortunately, like most federal bills, it hasn't made a lot of progress towards getting passed. But hopefully that'll change and it'll get the momentum it needs because it's a really important issue, as we just saw the other week.
What kind of problems do we face in trying to get this kind of legislation passed?
Other senators from other states, and I try not to be partisan on these during these events, but the reality is a lot of I'm not sure any Republican senator would support it, and because of the processes that exist in the U.S. Senate, in particular with the filibuster, that can really harm the chances of legislation moving forward just on a simple majority vote bill. Not to mention the fact that we have some Democrats, including Joe Manchin, who represents West Virginia, that have very different opinions on this. So it's an uphill climb, but it's a righteous one and one that we need to keep on working on.
All right, thank you. And our last question is, do you have any plans to support or add a more in-depth environmental component to the education curriculum in California?
It's a great idea. And as I'm sure you've seen, Katie, with your colleagues or with your peers, excuse me, environmental activism is being led by the youth. That's and for good reason, because you're the ones who are going to be living with this world that we leave behind for longer than we will. So I think it's a great idea. There have been numerous recent state level efforts to strengthen environmental curriculum. According to state law, climate change is included in environmental literacy, which schools are encouraged to teach, but education code does not mandate that schools teach it. So there was a bill last year that would have required a climate change curriculum for students. And this was in 2020. Unfortunately, it died kind of early in the process when COVID hit. Most bills not related directly to the COVID-19 emergency were shelved for the year. And so I think that's an issue that we need to bring back. And then this year's state budget provides $6 million in one-time Prop 98 funding to the superintendent of public instruction, which is actually going to be allocated to the San Mateo County Office of Education for the creation of free open education resources that are K through 12 standards-based curriculum units focused on climate change and environmental justice. And that's very wonky language that says that the San Mateo County Office of Education is going to be in charge of creating free open education resources around climate change and environmental justice, and then making those available to every other county office of education across the state. So this is definitely an issue that we are going to keep on working on.
Wow, I'm really looking forward to seeing some of this education reform.
Me too.
Assemblymember Berman, thank you so much for taking the time to answer our questions on the behalf of Bailey. Thank you, and I'd like to yield the rest of the time to general Q&A.
Awesome, thank you, Katie, and thanks to your peers and Bailey for what you're doing. It's like I mentioned earlier, so important, and having youth advocate and get involved is critically important to making sure that elected officials really understand the issues that you care about. And even if some of you might already be 18 and you might already be able to vote, if you're not, you're going to be voting soon. And you live in their districts, and they should listen to what you're concerned about. And they should really take that into account more in the decisions that they make. All right. So let's open it up to live questions from the audience. If you want to ask a live question, please use the raise hand feature. When it's your turn, my staff will grant you permission to speak. Please start by saying your first and last name and what school you attend. If you ask a live question and want the free boba voucher, just add your email to the chat after you speak, and we'll email you the voucher. Our first question, and I need to open up. Hold on, I'm gonna open up. Nope, not that one. Bear with me. We're gonna close that one. We're gonna open up this one and go to attendees. And to nobody's surprise, there are lots of good questions. So the first question, or lots of people want to ask the questions. I don't know what your questions are yet. So the first question is going to be from Satvik, who's actually one of the fantastic interns in my office. And I want to use this as an opportunity to plug our internship program. Please apply to be an intern in my office. Information is available for that on the website, on my website. So Satvik, you should now have permission to speak. Please say your name and what school you go to, and then ask your question.
Hey, Assemblymember Berman. My name is Satvik, and I go to St. Francis in Mountain View. I wanted to ask you something about high-speed rail. So last year, the governor wanted the Assembly to release the rest of the Prop 1A funding that the voters approved for high-speed rail, but this didn't happen, obviously. Do you support the release of these funds in next year's budget or in other bills?
Yeah, Savik, thank you for the question, and we'll see. We'll see. I think there are a lot of really good conversations going on right now between the High Speed Rail Authority, my colleague Laura Friedman, who chairs the Transportation Committee in the Assembly, the Speaker of the Assembly, Anthony Rendon, and Senate counterparts, to make sure the role that the legislature can play at this stage is in oversight and accountability. And that's a role that we take really seriously. It's a really important role, especially in a project that costs tens of billions of dollars. And frankly, in a project that has changed a lot in the last decade, and in a project that myself and a lot of my colleagues are very concerned about the annual promises that are made and claims that are made by the High Speed Rail Authority that never actually come to fruition. And unfortunately, we've been in a situation where we're constantly told, hey, this is the plan, this is how things are going, this is where we're going to be next year, this is how much it's going to cost. And then every year that changes. And at a certain point, we lose trust and we lose faith. And so the High Speed Rail Authority asked for the final tranche of bond funding over $4 billion. The reality when you dug into it was they don't need all of that money right now. They actually had enough money to keep on going into 2022. And then there's a real conversation about how much money they need for, what are the necessary projects for this stage of the what funding is necessary to accomplish the projects they're working on for this stage versus what funding did they want to allocate for things that we don't even know if those are going to happen yet. And so the legislature, this was one of our last opportunities to say, time out, explain this to us a little bit better, give us more data because we haven't been satisfied with what you've given us so far, and really prove to us that you're going to spend this money wisely and that it's necessary to spend that money right now. So I know those conversations have been ongoing. I know, the High Speed Rail Authority wanted all of that money by this past June. They didn't get what they wanted. But we're going to revisit this conversation as a legislature in January, and see what information, what additional information the High Speed Rail Authority has provided to us and how much money we really think they need to accomplish their goals over the next couple of years. So thank you, Satvik, for the question. It's a big issue, and a big issue that a lot of my constituents are very passionate about on both sides. Some are very supportive of high-speed rail. Some absolutely hate high-speed rail. I want to make sure that we spend that money responsibly. I also want to make sure that we focus a lot on transportation projects in the Bay Area, because that's what I see having the biggest impact on my communities is people who live in the East Bay, for example, or live a little further into the East Bay and have to commute to Palo Alto or Mountain View or Sunnyvale or Menlo Park for jobs. So we have a lot of different transportation priorities for the state, but I would love to see us develop a properly functioning high speed rail system as well. So hopefully we can accomplish that goal too. So next up, I'm gonna call on, is it Kristin Meyer? And I apologize in advance if I butcher anybody's last name, but Kristin, please let me know what your question is.
Hi, I'm using my mom's account. I'm actually Dashiell Meyer.
Sure, no
And
problem. Go ahead.
I am in 11th grade at Stanbridge Academy. I have Down syndrome, and I am an advocate for people with disabilities. I am wondering what your plans are to help people with disabilities with their education and housing, and making sure her people with disabilities get paid minimum wage in California.
It's a great question. Thank you for asking that question, and you know, working on better supporting our IDD community, our intellectual and developmental disabled or differently abled community is a huge issue for the legislature, for myself, and for a lot of colleagues. And this year, I don't remember the details off the top of my head, but this year we significantly increased funding to support the IDD community in California. This had been a multi-year effort, and something that I'd supported many years in a row, that at the end of the day, we were not successful getting the funding for to really support the IDD community. This year we were, and it was a really celebratory occasion. It was a very joyous occasion on the floor of the Assembly when we passed the budget with increased funding, you know, to make sure that you get the education that you deserve. And like you mentioned, you know, that we create more housing and housing opportunities for you to be able to you know, live on your own. And one thing that I've been really happy to see in a lot of communities in my district, including recently in Palo Alto, was approval of either approval or support, and hopefully future approval of affordable housing communities that have set aside a certain number of units for members of the IDD community. And I think that's fantastic, and something that we need to continue to do more to support, you know, you and all of your peers, because it's that's a responsibility that the state has that we haven't necessarily been meeting in the past. So if you want to provide us an email, we can send you an email with more specific information about the increased funding that we approved in this year's budget and some of those details. But it's going to be really meaningful, and it's going to make a big difference. And I'm really glad that we're doing it. It's long past due. So thank you very much for that really good question. So I'm going to now go to, I believe it's Jonathan Liu.
Yes. Hi, my name is Jonathan Liu. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a third-year medical student at Stanford. And my question is related to the state government's competence in engaging low-income and environmental justice communities in like bill-making processes, because some of the criticisms I've heard in the past is that the government hasn't been great about making information accessible to communities to make decisions about themselves. And I'm also thinking about not only communities, but community health centers, which tend to have like providers who are very busy, but serving the patients who are in the most need. So I was wondering if you can talk about better examples and worse examples of how the government has engaged frontline communities such as these. Like what?
And Jonathan, I apologize. I missed a little bit of the beginning. Can you just repeat the beginning of your question? It cut out for a second.
For sure. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah. So my understanding is that often lower resource communities, as well as environmental justice communities, tend to have historically been left out of a lot of decision making around not only environmental policy, but other kinds of policies. And similarly, I'm thinking about like community health centers and how often these are don't have the bandwidth to be participating in these kinds of decisions that impact them. So I was wondering what models of engagement have worked, and where do you think they can be better?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And, for example, in my district, we've got the Ravenswood Family Health Center, which is a fantastic community health clinic that we've engaged with on a myriad number of issues, especially around COVID and vaccine distribution to lower income communities in my district. So in terms of kind of engagement, I am not intimately familiar with the specifics of the types of engagement that the state and state agencies have with these health clinics. I know that I get emails directly from their executives and their board on a regular basis whenever they're worried about something that's happening. I'm always sure to either engage with them personally or have my staff reach out to them to find out more what we can do. But absolutely, whether it's on healthcare issues or environmental issues and environmental justice issues, there are a lot of communities in the state that have been neglected for a long time. And I guess I defer to them to give, and I'm all ears on finding out better ways that we can, communicate with them, make sure that they're engaged in the process of developing a lot of the different policies that are going to impact them. So I don't have a specific answer to your question necessarily, other than to say that I'm all ears on trying to figure out improvements that we can make to make sure that they're getting the support that they need from the state, and in a way that's easy for them to implement, and not in a way that's so onerous or complex that they just really can't even use it. Did that kind of address your question, Jonathan? Or
yeah, no, thank you for addressing it. Yeah, no, I appreciate it.
And any suggestions you've got, let us know. And if there are people that we should reach out to, please let us know, because you're immersed in it and seeing it at a much more detailed level than I am. So appreciate that. Okay. Excuse me. So now I'd like to go to Anushka Taman. Tamain.
Hi, yeah, it's Anushka Tamhane.
Tamhane.
I had a question. You talked about that like 10 out of 12 of your bills for the 2021 legislative year passed. But out of the few bills that didn't pass, specifically SB 67, which I think was renewable energy and retail, what changes are you looking to make at either your approach to the legislative process or the bill itself to help it have a better chance of getting through this year?
I'm sorry, which bill was that again?
SB 67.
So yeah, thanks for the question. So that's a Senate bill. So that
okay, it might be a different one, sorry. But there was a climate related bill that did not pass this year. So just in general, like, how would your approach to bills this in this legislative year, passing bills for the next legislative year change, and what would you change about the bills themselves?
Yeah, it's really case specific based on each individual bill. But I always try to learn from situations where like I alluded to earlier, where I've had multiple bills where I haven't been successful in one year, but either the very next year or 2 years later, we have been successful. And a lot of that can be me learning more about the issues, frankly, and tightening up the proposals that I'm making to try to address concerns that are raised by opposition. The first thing I learned when I got into elected office, even on the Palo Alto City Council before the State Assembly, is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And if I need to make changes to a policy, as long as it doesn't erode the kind of really foundational element of the policy. If I need to make some amendments to get support so that I can be successful, that's something that's a part of the legislative process. It's compromise. It's listening to colleagues who have concerns about different policies and doing everything that we can to address those concerns to get their support. Because I can be a purist about things, but at the end of the day, if I can't get 41 votes in the Assembly or 21 votes in the Senate, the whole thing dies. And oftentimes, I joke with colleagues that we talk about getting 80% of a loaf or 90% of a loaf. If you can get 80% of what you were trying to accomplish, or nothing, or 0% of what you were trying to accomplish, take the 80% and then keep on working to get that next 20%. So, in terms of strategies, a part of my process is really listening to the opposition, really listening to the issues that they raise, really listening to issues that my colleagues raise, because at the end of the day, they're the ones voting for the bills. And then seeing what we can do to address those concerns in a way that still maintains the structural integrity of the bill, that still really accomplishes what we're trying to accomplish. And so that's at a macro level, that's my approach with all the bills that I introduce, and we'll keep on working on those issues. Just because we aren't successful one year doesn't mean that we're not going to come back and be successful another year. So next up, Kathy Wenker, if that's right.
Yeah, my name's Caddy Wentker. I go to Pinewood, Pinewood High School. I'm a senior. I was just wondering, you've been talking a lot about like housing bills and building more housing, but I was just wondering how building those would also be, sorry, this is confusing wording.
No problem. It's a confusing issue.
How you're taking into account climate change and just environmental factors when you're considering these buildings, because I know construction can cause a lot of environmental problems, and I was just wondering if you're taking that into account as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think our housing crisis and climate change are inextricably linked. And the reason I say that is because of the housing crisis that we have in California. People who live here, people who work here, your teachers at Pinewood have to live further and further and further away from where they work. And because the housing, because even at Pinewood, where I'm sure teachers are very well compensated, it's not they're not paid enough to be able to afford to live anywhere near here. The cost of living in the Bay Area and Palo Alto and Los Altos, Los Altos Hills, Woodside, Atherton, Portola Valley, the areas around here is so astronomical, is so unaffordable for anybody who is not rich, or anybody who inherited their home, that they are forced to live further and further away, unless they made a ton of money, more often in tech, right? The tech industry, the economic engine of this area has created remarkable wealth for people who live in it, for people who work in it, but for all the people who support those folks. So for the teachers, or for the gardeners, or for the people who work in restaurants, or for the nurses at the hospitals, they are forced to live so far away from where they work, and where they work, frankly, to support us, to support those of us who are lucky enough to live in this area. And those people also probably don't drive electric vehicles. They probably drive internal combustion engine vehicles that are emitting massive amounts of pollution. And they're driving in from Gilroy, or they're driving in from Tracy, or they're driving in from even further, Stockton, or maybe even Sacramento. And they're driving alone because our public transportation system is inadequate. And they're driving gas-powered cars, and they're creating a massive amount of pollution that's really contributing to global warming. And so we must develop more housing, especially in the areas where demand is so high, where we've created a lot of jobs, but we haven't created nearly enough housing to meet the needs of those jobs. And so that people don't have to drive in from 40 miles, 50 miles, 80 miles away to those jobs every day to support us, to support me and you. There's also been a lot of data that's come out because of, which I can't believe I haven't touched upon yet, but the drought that we're going through right now. And a lot of data has come out that shows that denser housing, apartments, condominiums, townhomes, quadplexes, what they kind of call the missing middle housing, uses way less water per person than people who live in single family homes. And so if we can build some higher density housing to meet the housing crisis that we have and the housing affordability crisis that we have, data shows that those people will use much less water per person than a lot of the wealthier communities with more single family homes, with the bigger yards and lawns and pools and that kind of thing. So I definitely think that it's critically important that we consider climate change and you know, the different climate impacts as we're talking about, and hopefully really encouraging more housing development in our communities, because I think those two issues are inextricably linked. We also need to get smarter about how we develop housing and using more the electrification of which is something that I supported a lot when I was on the Palo Alto City Council, of our housing, moving people towards electric water heaters, electric heating in general, better materials, more solar. All these different issues are a part of addressing that kind of climate change crisis that we're facing. But so, Katie, I really appreciate the question. I think we definitely need to consider climate change in considering our housing policies. And for me, based on everything that I've seen, that means that we need to build more housing in the communities that have done a wonderful job creating jobs, but done a terrible job creating housing. So thank you very much for the question. Next up, I'm gonna bounce around a little bit. I'm gonna go to Katie Chang.
Hi, I'm Katie Chang, and I'm the student board member of the Dublin Unified School District in the East Bay. And I'm also in the running for the SBE student board member. And I'm curious about food security, actually. Given that AB 130 was passed this summer for universal free lunches and breakfasts, I was wondering if there's any effort to expand this kind of food security advancements to maybe dinner or weekends, since that was something that happened in my school district during COVID. I was wondering if that could also be considered at the higher education level for state-sponsored institutions. And I was just kind of wondering what kind of things are going on in the legislature right now addressing food security.
Yeah, it's a ton, so maybe I'll go top to bottom. At the higher education level, it's such a big priority, and such a big priority for me. That's why I've been championing basic needs and kind of what people call the real cost of college, which is so much more than just tuition and fees, but it goes to housing, it goes to food, it goes to healthcare, it goes to transportation, it goes to books. And so that's why I was really proud of the success that we've had that I mentioned earlier on developing a basic needs center at every California community college campus and hiring a basic needs coordinator at every campus. As we go down to the K through 12 level, what we accomplished this past year was astronomical. I had a bill last year that would have had the state spend about, I think it was $50 million a year to make it so that all low-income schools in California could provide free breakfast and lunch on campus to any student, to not have it, you didn't have to apply for it, you didn't have to show any sort of income eligibility. It's just a lot cheaper and a lot easier if we just have it applied to every student. And my colleague, I was going to bring that bill back this year for low-income schools. My colleague from the East Bay, Senator Nancy Skinner, who's the chair of the Senate Budget Committee, said, you know what, I want this to apply to all schools. I want this to apply to every school in California because yes, it's more prevalent in low-income schools, but we have a lot of low-income students who go to non-low-income schools. And there's a stigma around food insecurity, and there's a stigma around, you know, having to qualify and apply for free breakfast, free lunch, that isn't fair. And so we should make a policy where every student, no matter what school they go to in California, no matter what public school they go to in California, get free breakfast and free lunch, which is so critical to them being able to not be less worried about being hungry and focus more on what their teacher is saying and on learning. So let's just take a minute to recognize, like, and that means that the state is going to be spending, I think, up to $250 million, $250 million on this effort, which is a massive expenditure for California and pretty unprecedented. I would love to see us expand that. I think first we need to implement it. We just got that passed, you know, a couple of months ago. And so first we need to implement it, see how that's going, see what challenges there are, see what improvements we can make. And then sure, I'm all for you know, seeing if we can expand that to dinner, to weekends. I also strongly support, you know, our food pantries and nonprofits that also play a critical role in meeting that need for our more food insecure neighbors and friends and family. Early in the pandemic, I actually shaved my head on Facebook Live as a fundraiser for Second Harvest, the big food bank for this area. And we were able to raise almost $20,000 to support Second Harvest in their efforts. So, you know, I think it might take a patchwork. Some of it will be addressed by schools through the state. Some of it can be addressed by nonprofits and philanthropic organizations. And in my district, the Boys and Girls Clubs of the Peninsula stepped up in a huge way to support their community during the pandemic, and we're giving out 1,000 to 2,000 meals a night out of the Boys and Girls Clubs facilities in East Palo Alto, and I think maybe in Redwood City, either Redwood City or Menlo Park. Even if it's not all done through the schools, I think we definitely need to continue to provide more support to the multiple different agencies that are trying to make sure that everybody has a meal and hopefully a healthy 3 meals a day in our community, students and non-students alike. So thank you, Katie, for that question, and yeah, a really important issue. So now I'm going to call on Kiyoshi Taylor.
All right, can you hear me?
I can.
All right. So you touched on it briefly in your introduction, mental health reform. I live in Los Altos. I run a youth-led nonprofit that just became a 501c3, actually, Justice Vanguard. And one of the things we're very, very invested in is mental health and getting that into our schools. My biggest question is what would that look like, and how will that relate to also police reform? Because one of the biggest issues we're having when we deal with all these other schools and reform in mental health services and police reform is the SROs on campus. We see what the school to prison pipeline has and is doing to our students. The data around the country, including locally, proves it as well. And we're using these archaic systems in the name of mental health. So my biggest concern is when I hear people say we're going to do mental health resources, is they're just going to hire more resource officers and not be honest with themselves about the detriment police officers have for brown youth. And just being honest, like, this where the people of Justice Vanguard, 2 of us, including me, won, 2020 People of the Year. One of the nice things about 2020 was police actually left us alone in our cities because of the pandemic. And I was finally able to walk around my neighborhood, relax, and not worry about, and when I was coaching the baseball teams in our area, I didn't have to worry about the police harassing the kids on and off campus, and and not worry about there's something else going on the field, and so being a kid,
Okay.
being able to go play. So
Yeah.
what would mental health reform look like?
Yeah, it looks nothing. Thank you for the question. It looks nothing like hiring more school resource officers. That's not at all. Any of the efforts that I've worked on have to do with how do we provide training to administrators, teachers, and students, and students, right? We know, you know, as well as anybody, and everybody on here knows as well as anybody, that students talk to students a lot faster and a lot more comfortably than they might talk to a teacher or an administrator. So it's about making sure that students and teachers and administrators have the training that they need to be able to identify signs for when one of their peers might be struggling, and might need help and might need more of an intervention to get more medical support for whatever issue they're going through. So it includes providing that training. It includes integrating curriculum, mental health into curriculum, so that this is something that's destigmatized and just taught as a part of the educational process, so that people realize, when they might be struggling with something, that they realize this is normal. It's totally normal to be struggling with a mental health issue. This isn't something that I should hide or suppress or be ashamed of. So it's those kinds of issues. It doesn't have to do with hiring more disciplinary officers. It doesn't have anything to do with hiring more student resource officers. It has to do with kind of integrating mental health into curriculum. It has to do with making sure that that education professionals and students have the training they need to feel comfortable asking questions and helping either their students or their peers and friends. Those are the kinds of issues that we need to work on. You touched upon criminal justice issues, and I'll just say quickly, the California has done a lot in the criminal justice reform space over the last couple of years, whether it was a big police decertification bill that we passed this year, banning the use of corroded chokeholds and other kinds of techniques that police have used, strengthening the protections of people who are marching and utilizing their kind of First Amendment rights to protest, and a lot more. And so that's an area and I think I have a 100% record on supporting those bills that have come to me in front of on the state assembly. California for decades was way too, the mentality and the philosophy was to be tough on crime, and to lock people up for all sorts of offenses for a lot longer than was necessary. And we focused on imprisoning people, but we didn't focus on rehabilitating people. And that's also been a big focus of my colleagues and myself in our time in the legislature, is how do we find ways to make sure that we provide people with the training or schooling or whatever it is that they need, so that when they are let out of jail or when they are let out of prison, that they can reintegrate into society and be contributing members. So let's lock up fewer people for less amount of time, except for the really dangerous people, and there are plenty of really dangerous people and who do horrendous things. But for a lot of people, we've put them behind bars for too long, and they're frankly worse off when they come out. So there's a lot there, but it's a really important issue. All right, I'm gonna go to Dan Penalosa. I'll try to answer them more quickly.
Okay, hello. Hi, I'm Dan Pelosa. I am from Homestead High School in Cupertino, and I'm currently a junior. Kiyoshi mostly answered most of what I was going to ask, in the question, but there just another bit was this that I'm trying to find again. Oh, right. So I remember how you mentioned that you didn't want more SROs and other disciplinary officers on campus, but the ones that are currently on campus, suspension rates and implicit biases are proven to be exacerbated by police presence on campuses. And I just came off of a board meeting the other day, specifically for FUHSD, where the police showed up and basically said, "We want to maintain this relationship. Please put us back on campus." I just wanted to know what your thoughts were in regards to having cops be on campus and have presences, and what actions would you want to take to either maintain or dissolve ties to districts?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll be honest, it's an area where I need to spend more time talking to students and also more time talking to teachers and administrators and my over 100 local school board members that live in my district, to get a better understanding of the issues and the pros and cons. It's not an issue that I am intimately familiar with, and so probably one that I need a lot more information before I offer up an opinion on whether or not we should kind of eliminate the practice entirely. And I have colleagues who very progressive Democrat colleagues who have served in those roles that have expressed to me, at least, that and who support criminal justice efforts just like I do, but who think that school resource officers have a role to play. So I'm open to that, argument. I think, I would be interested in learning more about the different opinions all around the education landscape, to get a better understanding of whether or not this is an area where the state needs to step in, or whether or not we should continue to allow local school districts to do what they think is best for their communities and their students. So I appreciate both of you bringing the issue up, and that tells me that this is an issue that I need to spend more time looking at, which is a really helpful outcome of today's, of today's forum. All right, so I promised that we'd do some chat questions as well, and we have still 22 people who have their hand raised for live questions. I'm going to pivot to some of the chat questions, and then if obviously I love people's passion and the fact that there are so many questions. We're not going to get to all of them in the next 13 minutes, but if you want to submit your questions either through the chat or on my website, we'll do our best to get you and provide your contact information. We'll do our best to get you an answer back as soon as we're able to. So let me go find the document that my staff has been kind enough to curate on, and I'm going to put this here and this here, and hopefully, okay. All right, so I'll try to hit these quickly. So the first question was, I would like to know if Governor Newsom signed the bill prohibiting the sale of gas blowers. Even cities in Florida have totally outlawed them from operating. We're behind in controlling them. Not only the sale, but the use should be prohibited as soon as possible. There's too much pollution and illness caused by gas blowers and lawnmowers. Thanks for your concern and reply. So yes, Governor Newsom did sign this bill this month, about a week and a half ago. The bill, AB 1346, like I mentioned earlier, bans the new sale of gas leaf blowers and lawnmowers and other small engines beginning in 2024. It does not affect the use of equipment that people already have. The requirement is on manufacturers and on businesses that sell it, not necessarily on end users. And this proposal is estimated to reduce emissions from this category of engine, from small off-road engines, by about 93% by 2035. And like I mentioned earlier, we funded $30 million in incentives for small businesses to start buying clean zero emission equipment. And so, the questioner asked, why don't we ban the use? And I was barely able to get this bill out of the Senate. I struggled to get enough votes out of the Assembly. It was kind of mid 40s. I think I got 46, 47 votes in the Assembly. I needed 41. I got 21 votes in the Senate, and I needed 21. So I got the bare minimum amount of support by my colleagues in the legislature to be successful. And this kind of goes along with what I mentioned earlier about don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I can only you know, I kind of have to be pragmatic about what I can accomplish. And we decided that this was the strongest that I could get through the legislature. It turned out we were right. I thought I had 23 or 24 senators that were going to vote for the bill. And at the last minute, a couple of them backed out. A couple of them essentially lied to me. They said they would support it. And then when the vote came, they didn't. So I wish it could be stronger also. But at least we're doing something. And we're actually the first state in the country to do this. We're the first state in the country to ban the sale of new gas-powered, small off-road engines. And so I think it's hopeful. I'm hopeful that other states are going to adopt this as well. So the next question is, my brother, who is a Cub Scout, who's 10, wanted to address reduction of one-time grocery plastic bags used in grocery stores and to help save our oceans from plastic. How is the government addressing this issue? How can this awareness be spread to the people to reduce plastic? And that's awesome that your brother's Cub Scout troop is considering such an important issue. California already has a ban on carry-out plastic bags from grocery stores. However, during the height of the pandemic, when people were unable or uncomfortable about reusing kind of their bags and taking their bags into grocery stores or restaurants, the law was temporarily waived. It is back in place now. The law does not currently cover bags in grocery stores that are used for produce. So you can put, your couple of, your broccoli or your beets or whatever into a bag in the produce section. But there has been discussion in the legislature about expanding the ban to include all plastic bags in stores, which I think, very well might be an issue that comes forward in the next couple of years. So, but it's a great question, super important issue. And to be honest, I see too many restaurants that still use these bags, even though they're not supposed to, when they provide carry out. The next question is on wildfires. Wildfires in California are getting worse and worse each year. Could you talk about your solution to this problem? And then they put in paren, maybe controlled burns. Such an important issue and such a crisis that California is going through right now. We are seeing more wildfires, higher frequency, greater damage that's done in the past 5 years, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. Last year, the most acreage burned in wildfires in California history. This year is the second most, and our wildfire season, unfortunately, is not done. In April, the legislature passed and the governor signed a package totaling $536 million for a broad set of investments that support a statewide strategy on forest health and fire prevention. And we've also allocated an additional $988 million, so $1.5 billion total, in additional wildfire and forest resilience projects and programs. This includes funding to create resilient wildlands, support wildfire fuel breaks, advance science-based management and streamlined permitting, and support community hardening to protect from wildfires. We also need to address the root causes of drought and extreme heat that are fueling worsening wildfires in California. That means, like we've discussed, reducing greenhouse gas emissions that are fueling climate change by transitioning to a decarbonized clean energy economy. But the questioner had specifically mentioned controlled burns. Yes, absolutely. We need to expand the use of controlled burns. We need to make sure that they're done safely. But I believe, passed a bill earlier this year, possibly by Senator Dodd, I think I read recently, to make it easier for people to do controlled burns. So that definitely needs to be a part of the solution. So there was a question about my bill 928, which the Student Transfer Achievement Reform Act. I spoke about that a little bit earlier. So I don't want to dive too much deeper into that right now. Let's take on some other questions. What does the mandatory ethnic studies process look like at the moment? So some of you might know that this year the legislature passed and the governor signed AB 101, which will phase in a mandatory ethnic studies course into high school curriculum. This was a bill that I was proud to support. And here's how it will work. In the 2025 to 26 school year, high schools will have to start offering an optional one semester class in ethnic studies. Then beginning with the graduating class of 2029 and 2030, all high school students will be required to take a 1-semester class in ethnic studies. So right now, schools can voluntarily teach ethnic studies, and many schools in California already teach ethnic studies. This will say that by 2025, 2026, you have to offer it, and it'll be a graduation requirement for the graduating class of 2029, 2030. Let me just, I think there's one more question here. I'm a medical student and climate advocate. Healthcare emits 8% of US greenhouse gas emissions and continues to rise. However, the Department of Healthcare Services and Department of Healthcare Access and Information do not currently have a plan to cut emissions in this industry consistent with a livable future. Would you support a bill to ask these agencies to design an annual plan to reduce healthcare emissions and prepare our healthcare institutions to be climate resilient? I apologize, I think I muted it before I finished that. Our healthcare institutions to be climate resilient in California. This is a great question. And to be honest, a question that I wasn't that familiar with. I didn't realize that the healthcare industry contributed this much emission. So I would definitely be interested in exploring this further and making our healthcare system more climate resilient. And to the person who asked this question, it would be great if you could follow up directly with my office to talk more about this idea. I am all about identifying, we talk about the transportation sector, the construction sector, existing buildings, all of that. I'm all about, kind of like I did with the small off-road engines bill, finding areas that we're not necessarily talking about, but where there's a lot of greenhouse gas reductions that could be accomplished. And so this would definitely be an interesting area. Y'all are still adding more questions to the chat. I'm incredibly impressed and a little bit exhausted and overwhelmed by all of the questions that you have, but also I love it. I love it. Unfortunately, we've only got a couple minutes left, and so we're going to wrap up. But this is exactly, to be honest, what I expected from tonight's youth town hall. Is a lot of questions that are well researched, that are very direct, and that are addressing some of the biggest issues that we're facing as a society. And so we're gonna, I want to thank my staff who do 90% of the work, and they're also the ones that are intaking all of the different questions and comments that you have. We're going to continue to look through them all over the coming days and weeks, and if I wasn't able to address your question, we'll get you an answer as quickly as possible. Give us some time because you've submitted a lot of questions, but these are really important issues, and my hope, frankly, is that I get a couple of bill ideas out of the different issues that you've raised and questions that you've asked, because these types of events are really where I get some of the best ideas from folks like you, especially youth who are really passionate and knowledgeable about issues that you see in your life every day, and that are impacting your community and that are going to impact future generations. So I just wanted to say thank you. I think at the highest number, we had over 100 participants in today's youth town hall. Thank you for taking time out on your Wednesday night to join me and let me know what's on your mind and what you're passionate about. Don't stop advocating. I meant it when I said it earlier, that when youth show up to a city council meeting, when youth show up to a public event, we listen, and elected officials, we're going to call on you because we love the fact that you showed up. And we're really going to listen very intently to what you're saying, and see what we can do to help. So thanks so much for taking the time to join me tonight. Thank you for your questions, and I look forward to hopefully seeing folks in person more really soon. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night and stay safe.